Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Professor Hall, and we are now in our poetry unit. So, Module 7. And why did I put poetry at the end? So that you'd have less to read when you are coming up on finals and your final project. I still wanted us to read a few poems. Poetry we didn't talk about as much, but there are a number of poets living and working at this time in this lost generation literary circle, and so I did want to have you have just like a taste of some of the works. We moved throughout the class when looking at prose. That's anything that's not poetry. We saw some short stories by Dorothy Parker. We saw some who was living in New York at the time, and then we moved through Sherwood Anderson, who was a little bit older, and into the Fitzgeralds and Hemingway, and then our last book by Nathaniel West was published in 1939, so at the tail end of this literary movement. So the poems that you're going to be looking at for this week are kind of scattered throughout this time period, but we have some more traditional forms with Edna St. Vincent Millay writing a sonnet that is a little more scandalous than some of the things that Shakespeare wrote. I have some short lectures for you, one in particular about the poem Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town by E.E. Cummings, and some questions about that. You're also going to be looking at Robert Frost, who is really kind of bucking the trend and kind of not happy with the experimental style of the modernist lost generation poets. I really wouldn't even classify him necessarily as being lost generation. It's just that he lived and worked during the same time period. And then, at long last, as promised in week 1, if you remember or don't, Gertrude Stein. I did not have you read these in week 1 as my college professor did when I took a similar course, because it's crazy. And if you try to decipher what she is saying, you will not be able to. The point of Stein's work is, number one, that she was, as Ernest Hemingway said in Movable Feast, she was a little bit lazy and she did not edit any of her work, and it was really stream of consciousness writing. It just kind of came out of her, and you can tell. But a little bit like Nathaniel West, who's writing in this expressionistic way, so was Gertrude Stein, and her work really could be compared to Picasso. If you think about Picasso, his Cubist period, where you can kind of tell what shape is there, but you really have to decipher it. That's sort of what she's doing with her little tender button poems, that she is just sort of describing things and you subjectively put onto it whatever you think it means, much like a modernist painter. And then in our discussion forum, I talk about what we talked about the first day of class, and then have you kind of reflect on the course as a whole in our last discussion forum before your final project. You also this week, because you have less to read, and I mentioned this last week as well, you're going to be doing your annotated bibliography. So you're going to have 4 sources for your paper, at least 2 from library databases, though I really recommend that you get all 4 from them. The other 2 have to be reliable, and it's sometimes hard to find reliable things that aren't just from like GradeSaver or whatever online. So you have to have at least one that's sort of biographical or historical, and one that focuses a little bit more on theory and interpretation. You can obviously also have more than that. The books or stories you're examining don't count for the toward your 4 sources. So there is an example of how to do that, having the citation, bullet pointing out some main ideas, and then giving me a couple quotes that you're going to use in your paper. So that is it for this week. Again, if you find more than 4 sources, that's fine. Just make sure that you check with me if you change your sources as well. And be sure also to look at my comments if I've given them already. for your first checkpoint where you had your draft thesis statements, because sometimes if they're too broad, your research is going to be all over the place. And if you want to change your topic, you can run that by me too. So that's it. Thanks, everybody.